are these people?
As I said earlier, I didn't find this on our usual sources where we do research to do the show. I actually heard about this story from an entertainment podcaster that I listened to. And one of her audience members brought this story to her while on stream, and she reported on that right in the stream. So, but this was kind of but this is an example. When I first heard it, I was just kind of like, you gotta be, like I told Indy, like this is an example of, you gotta be fucking kidding me. So, so the gist of it is the US is asking a favor from China. Funny enough.
China.
So we're going to get into a little geopolitic situation here. So again, this relates to Iran. And within Iran, there's a waterway called the Strait of Hormuz. All right. So I'm sure most of you do not know where the strait is or what its significance. So what we do, being crying in teacher mode, I'm going to tell. Well, I'm not, but the site at TTK is going to explain where the strait is and its significance, and you could probably figure this out fairly quickly about why we would be interested in this strait and what it has to do with China. So let's get into it. We're not going to play the whole thing. We'll play about half. And then we'll get into it. More details.
Yes, sir.
On this channel, I love to talk about geopolitics, which is the interaction between geography, how the Earth is shaped, and politics, how people and countries interact with each other. This time, we'll discover why the Strait of Hormuz is so important, and how being narrow has put this stretch of water at the center of global international tensions. Before we dive into why the strait is so important, let's find out where on Earth it is. This is the Arabian Peninsula. On one side of the peninsula, the Arabian Sea is connected to the Mediterranean by the Red Sea, which runs between the peninsula and the continent of Africa and joins the Mediterranean Sea here through the Suez Canal. On the other side of the peninsula, the Arabian Sea runs into the Gulf of Oman, which is connected to the Persian Gulf. Between these two gulfs is this very narrow stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is bounded on either side by the countries of Iran, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. The Strait of Hormuz helps transport loads of oil per day on some of the biggest ships on Earth. We'll go into more detail about that in a moment. Because of how narrow the strait is and the volume of oil that is transported through it, the Strait of Hormuz is the world's most important choke point for the transport of oil. Just to get an idea of the scale of the amount of oil and other energy products transiting the strait, here's some quick maths. In 2018, the average number of barrels of oil and other petrol liquids passing through the strait was about 21 million barrels per day. Each barrel is about 159 litres, which equates to a total of over 3 billion litres, or more than 1,300 Olympic swimming pools of liquid per day. This is about 21% of the entire world's daily petrol consumption. 1/3 of all of the sea-transited oil on Earth travels through the strait, as well as 1/4 of all of the traded natural gas. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Because of this, ships transiting the strait must stick to strict shipping lanes. Despite its narrow width, the Strait of Hormuz is deep enough to accommodate the largest ships on Earth, the epically named Very Large and Ultra Large crude carriers. Large ships exiting the Persian Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz have to participate in a carefully choreographed dance. The first shipping lane starts in the territorial waters of Iran. It then passes between 3 islands, which are currently administered by Iran but claimed by the UAE. Next, our supertanker must pass into Omani territorial waters to transit the narrowest shipping lanes in the narrowest part of the strait. Once through the strait, there are more shipping lanes in the Gulf of Oman that can take ships back into Iranian territorial waters. We've talked about how the Persian Gulf is connected to the Mediterranean Sea via the Strait of Hormuz, but actually in 2018, about 76% of the crude oil transmitted through the strait headed the other direction, to Asia, and most of that went to only 5 countries: China, India, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. To get to the large markets in East Asia, oil tankers usually have to traverse another oil choke point, the Strait of Malacca, which we might talk about in another video. So, the Strait of Hormuz is narrow. So narrow that it falls within the territorial waters of the boundary countries. This means that any incidents within the strait have the potential to shut down transit, or at worst, to spark conflict between countries. Just a few months before the release of this video, there were attacks on ships in the Gulf of Oman, near to the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Incidents like these threaten the stability of the strait and increase tensions between boundary countries. Now we know just how important the Strait of Hormuz is to global oil trade, we can imagine just how damaging any disruption to the flow of oil through the strait would be to countries reliant on receiving the oil and on those countries reliant on the income from selling oil.
So,
Ben
I think you
Gurion
can
Canal.
put 2 and 2 together,
Anybody?
right?
And that's supposed to be a thing, right?
What?
Ben Gurion.
Yes.
Which is to get around this particular shipping thermopylae,
right, but this
if
is
you will.
but this is kind of a different area though. But you can argue this is kind of you can argue this is part of the greater Israel plan, sure.
Yeah.
But I think more immediately, it's still the idea of like oil trade is very big in this part of the world. Which is mostly affiliated with Iran.
Right.
And any issues with that, you can guess what's going to happen.
But if the Ben Gurion Canal existed, this wouldn't be as powerful a thing, because Israel would then own that port that would allow you passage, and you don't have to go through Iran and Yemen's missiles,
Right. But kind of what I was saying before, this is in part what makes Iran rich.
Yes.
So, so don't think that Iran is this backwards country that you're hearing in the media. That's what the higher ups want you to think, so that it's easy for them to make the justification of bombing the place without necessarily mentioning this piece, which ultimately affects us. So, and that's my guess why Trump was kind of crashing out over the weekend, because someone probably told him, yo, like, you need to chill with Iran, because if we can't get our oil, that's going to affect us, and that's going to affect our wallets.
Right.
So the US, in our way of what the fuck, asked China to stop Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz. So this is from the BBC. We don't like independent mainstream media that much, but I couldn't find it anywhere else on other independent media sources. So
yeah,
we got to deal with the BBC for this.
So put on your "Where's the BBC" bullshit glasses as we go through this article.
Right, but it's general. I think it's general enough that I think it's okay.
I feel you.
So they're good with general shit, but not with more detailed shit. So, but anyway, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called on China to prevent Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important shipping routes. His comments came after Iran state-run Press TV reported that Parliament had approved a plan to close the strait, but added that the final decision lies with the Supreme National Security Council. Any disruption to the supply of oil would have profound consequences for the economy. China, in particular, is the world's largest buyer of Iranian oil and has a close relationship with Tehran. Oil prices rose following the U.S. attack on Iranian nuclear sites, with the price of the benchmark Brent crude reaching its highest level in 5 months. I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call Iran about that, because they heavily depend on the Strait of Hormuz for their oil, Rubio had said in an interview with Fox News on Sunday. If they close the straits, it will be economic suicide for them. No, for us, you mean. And we retain options to deal with that, but other countries should be looking to that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours. Around 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, with major oil and gas producers in the Middle East using the waterway to transport energy from the region. Any attempt to disrupt operations in the strait could send global oil prices skyrocketing. Oil prices jumped briefly when trading began on Monday, with Brent climbing to $81.40 a barrel in dollars. However, it then slipped down to around $76.30, below where it had started the day. In his post on Truth Social platform on Monday, US President Donald Trump said, "Everyone, keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it." Saul Kafanik, head of research.
Why would you?
at
What a
MST,
fucking stupid. First of all, what is it? The double, triple, quadruple, quintuple bluff? What are you? You're like, Iran can read. They can read. Like, they just go, oh, so the oil thing's working. Got it. We'll keep that up.
Right.
Like, okay.
No, but this is what I mean that he was crashing out, because he realized the implications of what he did by bombing Iran. So, and I'll get more into it later, but Iran could very well say, okay, you bomb us, fuck your oil.
Right.
So let your prices go up. We don't give a fuck. So, but anyway, Saul Kafanik, head of energy research at MST Financial, said the U.S. is now positioned with an overwhelming defense posture in the region to be prepared for any Iran counterattacks. But the risk of oil prices is the situation could escalate severely further. The cost of crude oil affects everything from how much it costs to fill up your car to the price of food at the supermarket. China, in particular, buys more oil from Iran than any other nation, with its imports from Iran surpassing 8 million barrels per day last month, according to data by ship tracking firm Fortexia. Other major Asian economies, including India, China, Japan, and South Korea, also rely on heavily on crude oil that passes through the strait. Energy analyst Vandana Hari has said Iran has little to gain and too much to lose from closing the strait. Iran risks turning its oil and gas producing neighbors in the Gulf into enemies and invoking the ire of the key market China by disrupting traffic in the strait, Ms. Hari told BBC News. The U.S. joined the conflict between Iran and Israel over the weekend, with President Trump saying Washington had obliterated Tehran's key nuclear sites, which actually wasn't true.
Bullshit. Yeah.
However, it is not clear how much damage the strikes inflicted, with the UN's nuclear watchdog saying it was unable to assess the damage at the heavily fortified Fordo underground nuclear site. Iran has said there was only minor damage to Fordo. Trump also warned Iran it would face far worse future attacks if the country did not abandon its nuclear program. On Monday, Beijing said the U.S. strikes had damaged Washington's credibility and called for an immediate ceasefire. China's UN ambassador Fu Kong, I guess that's how you say its name, said all parties should restrain the impulse of force and add fuel to the fire, according to state-run CCTV report. In an editorial, Beijing state newspaper Global Times also said that U.S. involvement in Iran had further complicated and destabilized the Middle East situation, and that it was pushing for the conflict to an uncontrollable state. So I have some thoughts on this, because basically, as I said earlier, the U.S. is asking China to do a solid and not close the strait. But that in the guise of, oh, it's going to affect every other country in the world. Well, who says that Iran would close the strait completely? It can very well continue to give oil to China and India, especially since those are BRICS nations. But basically to the US, just basically say, fuck you. We ain't giving shit to you or anyone in the West. And as we know, China has said that they would support Iran if the US continues to escalate. Pakistan has also said that they would get into it too. So, so really, Iran, in my mind, now I'm not good at geopolitics in this way, but again, the U.S. is saying don't close the strait at all. But who's to say that Iran has to? You know, if they're going to say, they can very well say "fuck you" to the West and not give oil to them. So not sure exactly how that would work, but in my mind, that's what they can do. Any thoughts?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
So shout out to Nico again, because he did report on this. And he breaks this down a little bit more. So let's see what he has to say regarding this, and then we'll talk about it. Oh, I think people are saying, Miko, you're muted.
Oh. Here, I can fix that.
You gotta play it again.
The legislature has voted to close the Strait of Hormuz pending the approval of the Supreme Leader, and the United States is freaking out. For those who don't know, the Strait of Hormuz is this narrow body of water that actually controls the flow of 20% of the world's oil supply. And it just so happens that Iran is in complete control of that strait. Now, we know the United States is freaking out about this because in a recent interview, Marco Rubio said that the United States would be willing to appeal to China to have them interfere and stop Iran from closing the strait. Because yeah, China does have a vested interest in that strait as well, considering 50% of their oil supply flows through that strait.
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that. But other countries should be looking at that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours. It would be, I think, a massive escalation that would merit a response, not just by us, but from others.
Yeah, but there are a couple of things to unpack here with that statement. You don't think Iran knows that China needs this strait to remain open? And you don't think China knows that? And you don't think China was well aware that this was a calculated risk that Iran would have to take, which is probably why they sent ballistic missile technology to Iran in January? And yeah, I guess you could try to appeal to China, but who do you think China would side with in this situation? Because yeah, the hit to China would be massive, but it would be temporary if Iran were able to overcome this aggression from the United States and Israel. Not to mention there would be some logistical issues. However, they could just open the strait for China. But also,
right,
do you think that China is more worried about a temporary hit to their economy or a permanent hit via regime change that we all know the United States is trying to engage in? So yeah, of course, China will probably say they don't want them to close the strait. However, they're aware of the situation that Iran is in, and they don't want to lose their economic ally to regime change, while the United States is actively threatening them every single day. And then there's the part where Iran is fully aware of how important this strait is, and that, yeah, the United States might not be as affected economically as the rest of the world, even though they still would be, but the United States allies would be decimated economically, incentivizing them to intervene and demand a ceasefire in order for their economy to survive, regardless of where they stand in their relationships with either Iran or the United States. Understand, if Iran closes this strait, prices of oil barrels would rise from roughly $75 to $130 to $150 per barrel. What that means for you as a consumer is that your gas prices would increase about $1 to $2 per gallon if you live in the US, and the supply chain would be wrecked. So all of your goods would become more expensive than they already are. Now, many people warn that US aggression towards Iran would lead to an economic crash, and this is one of the ways that that would happen. The United States was aware that this was always a possibility, and yet and still they decided to attack Iran under the false pretext of nuclear weapons that they don't have Anyway, now you will hear a counterpoint to this that Iran's economy would be hurt. However, they already took a 20% dip in GDP because of the sanctions put on them in 2018 after Trump put out the JCPOA. They've had more sanctions put on them since then. And think about it. Do you feel like they fear a temporary dip in their economy as a part of a strategic long-term move to bring peace to their region, or a permanent economic problem brought about by a total regime change where we know the United States and the UK and Israel and their allies would control the strait, and Iran would probably see little to none of that money? And to put a fine point on the matter, I wouldn't really be counting on China to intervene in any significant way, considering Iran has actually been exporting oil through the black market to China for years. So yeah, I wouldn't really count on China to come to y'all rescue. But I will tell you this, I'm sure that Iran is praying for y'all to retaliate if they close the strait instead of negotiating. Because this isn't 1988 and this isn't Operation Praying Mantis, Iran. This is 2025. We just let off some hypersonic missiles that Israel could do nothing about, and y'all just had to sit there and watch it happen, Iran. And considering how strategic militarily Iran has been as of late, if they're willing to make this gamble, it's probably because they know they have a royal flush and they're just waiting on y'all to make a stupid move for them to take all the chips.
Well,
Any thoughts?
I mean, interesting theory, you know? Like,
Right.
we'll see how much China is willing to throw in on that bargain, you know?
Well, I do want to get into China a little bit because this is kind of part where this is the part where I was like, when I first heard the story, it's just like, US, what the actual fuck you doing? Because the US, compared to what they're saying, oh, we don't want the world's economy to be affected. The US is saying, oh, we don't want the world's economy to be affected. They don't give a fuck. Like, they care about our economy being affected, you know? So China can't fuck with our bag, but we can fuck with theirs. Case in point. So in January, at the beginning of the year, if you go to screen, so this is a tweet from Posthumous Reviews. We didn't report on this, but just want to remind you all. Like, after a meeting with President Donald Trump's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Panamanian President Jose Raul Molino has announced that Panama will not be renewing their agreement with China's Belt and Road Initiative and instead increase U.S. investment in Panama. So basically, U.S. punked Panama, and again, we got the Panama Canal issue here. For the U.S., basically, U.S. said to Panama, "Don't fuck with China anymore." Basically,
okay.
So basically affecting their bag. So you can play the clip.
All that beautiful bean footage.
Una cosa importante, que es una
An
decisión
important thing, which is a
adopté y
decision
se la
that I adopted and communicated to him,
Memorandum de
the
entendimiento
Memorandum
del
of
año
Understanding
2017
of the
sobre
year
la ruta de la
2017
seda
on the road,
de
Belt and Road Initiative, will not be renewed by my
Road
government.
Initiative no será
Belt and
renovado
Road
por
Initiative.
mi
They
gobierno.
spelled it wrong.
Eso es así.
That is
Vamos a
so.
estudiar la
We're
posibilidad
going to
que
study
se
the
puede terminar
possibility of whether it can be finished
antes,
earlier
¿no?
or not.
Pero creo que le toca
But I think it's
en
his
1 o 2
turn
años la renovación
in 1 or 2 years to
o cada
renewal
3.
because it's everywhere.
Así que
So this
Every
initiative
3.
that was signed,
Yeah.
esa iniciativa que se firmó cuando
when it was signed at the time it was
se
signed,
firmó, en el tiempo que se firmó, no será renovada por mi
will
gobierno.
not be renewed by my government.
Creo que
I believe that
esta
this
visita
visit
abre un camino para
paves the
construir
way for building a new
una
stage
nueva
of
etapa de
relationships.
relaciones. Así lo veo yo, así lo
That's how I
sentí de
see it.
parte
That's how I felt
del
about it on
secretario
behalf of the Secretary
Marco
Rubio.
Rubio. Y
And that,
a la vez
at the same time,
tratar
try
la mayor
to,
posibilidad de que se incrementen las
as far as
inversiones de los
possible,
Estados Unidos
increase U.S. investment in Panama.
en Panamá. Le expliqué una serie de
I
proyectos
explained a series of infrastructure
de
projects
infraestructura que el gobierno tiene
that the government has in portfolio folder on the grounds that, and at the time that the bids are made, that will start very soon. Well, can be entered. So yeah. So basically, as I said, the U.S. fucked over China's bag in Panama regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. So basically, the U.S. said, "Don't fuck with China anymore. We will be the ones to provide you the means for the infrastructure that you need. Don't deal with China anymore." So basically, this punk ass bitch was like, "Okay." So it's funny how the U.S. has a right to tell other countries don't fuck with China, but now we're saying to China to prevent our bag, tell Iran not to close the strait. So plus, and we know this, given the tariffs that the U.S. has placed on China in the last couple of months, So this is kind of like the fuck shit that I was saying before. It's like, how dare the U.S. have the right to feel like, oh, we could tell other countries what to do, but yet we are able to fuck with everybody else. So
Right.
I wanted to play this clip because this went viral. This was over like how, especially on TikTok, there was a lot of people who were like, due to the tariffs, that the Chinese were basically like, oh, the shit that you were buying that you thought was expensive? No, we were actually making them, and we were actually making them for this much, and you were stupid for paying this much in order to get the goods that you want. So there was a lot of talk with the Chinese basically pulling behind the curtain, basically saying, the expensive shit that you thought was actually worth this much actually cost like pocket change. It's just that the West was up costing the cost because for profit. So, but I forgot what his guy is, but I know it's a higher up in the Chinese government. So this is in the UK where they talk about the tariffs and how it would affect them. So this was his response to our proposal on the tariffs on China. Go ahead.
How about with sound? That would be good.
The problem is that in this scenario, to use your metaphor, the US has the bigger gun. And so China ends up having more to lose from this trade war, doesn't it? It can't sustain the loss of 15% of its export market, i.e. what you export to the US.
Not at all. China is fully prepared to fight to the very end because the world is big enough that the United States is not the totality of the market in the world. So if the United States wants to go in that direction of completely shutting itself out of the China market, be my guest.
Yeah, and China will lose the US market, which, as I've said, is 15%.
We don't care. We don't care. China has been here for 5,000 years. Most of the time, there was no United States, and we survived. Right. And if the United States wants to bully China, we will deal with the situation without the United States. And we expect to survive for another 5,000 years.
You might want to put "we don't care."
Okay.
But I imagine, like given China's stance, because the tariffs have not really affected them that much. Basically, they were like, "Fine, we don't have to."
I ain't scared of you, motherfuckers.
Right, we don't have to fuck with you,
Right.
And so I think given that, like China can easily give a fuck you to the U.S. regarding their favor in what they're proposing, but basically, it's funny how the US is using China to be like, you tell Iran not to close it instead of telling Iran directly to close the strait, not to close the strait, or at least go into some type of deal so that, their money will not be affected or whatever. But yes, but I think you mentioned the Ben Gurion Canal, the Great Israel Project. Yes, it's not been said, but you can get the implication of all of that regarding how rich this strait is, especially since Iran owns it. So that's not said, but that's probably part of the Greater Israel Project, is that they're able to own this strait as well. So they're able to control the waterways on behalf of the U.S. as well. So again, don't believe the hype that Iran is a backwards third world country. It is not, given even in this, you can kind of tell that they have money in order for it to be as rich with the oil that, that one, they're able to produce, but two, able to ship basically anywhere in the world. But but again, this is just kind of the example of like, like they're calling Iran the bully. No, we're the bully, and we're trying to tell other countries what they need to do for our benefit, but we're not doing the same for other countries in terms of like, we're trying to fuck over China's economy right now, but yet that we're asking them to do us the solid and tell Iran not to close the strait, because if we do, our economy is going to be affected, which will affect you, like the regular schmegular person, in terms of everything that you're buying, which will probably lead into a recession. And that people have been saying that we've been heading into recession at some point later in the year. But this will.
We've already been one.
I would argue we've been in one, but this would speed this up. Any last thoughts before we shut down this segment?
No.
But
Good luck.
But I know our audience is smart. So like, here oil, you can easily make. But I felt this was important to share because I don't think anyone in mainstream media would talk about this, right? Other than like the BBC. But I think it's important to make the case as to why we're willing to go to war with Iran, given the resources. So once again, colonialism makes its way into the Middle East and trying to exploit a resource that we don't have a right to exploit. And instead of going in diplomacy and actually trying to end things, that maybe things would be easier for us, no, we got to decide to bomb the shit. And as I said, Trump, probably someone gave him a message being like, you don't want to do that and affect your base and have them feel a way about you in a way that they already feel about you. So him by backtrack, pussy pop, whatever you want to call it,
right.
To try and smooth it over and failing miserably. So, but again, this is ultimately in the name of Israel, which I find pathetic.
Pathetic.
And talking about stories like these is why we are demonetized. So if you want to support us, you know what to do. But for those of you who are new or might be now, because I know we have a couple people that are streaming at the same time, you can scan the QR code you see on the screen, or you can type in the Ko-fi link that you see at the bottom of the screen there. Or if you're in the YouTube chat, you can type in !donate, all one word, and the Ko-fi link will pop up. You can also give on Substack, Cash App, and PayPal if you prefer those methods. Those links are in the description below. And as we always say, we appreciate your giving. You don't feel entitled to give, but if you want to support us, the free way is to like, share, and subscribe to our content. And give this video a like, whether if you're watching this as a clip, please. And let us know what you think. Are you aware of the significance of the Strait of Hormuz and how valuable it is to the West as well as to the East? And what do you think China's response is going to be in terms of this? Do you think that China will follow up with Iran and basically say, don't close the strait, or will try to give two deuces to the US and basically say, we don't care? As we heard that guy say, we don't care. Like, you can fuck off with your economy. And again, I feel like Iran, they're saying like, the implication is that if they close the strait entirely, that will affect everybody. But again, I'm making the case of, and again, what's to say that Iran can say, China, we can continue trading with you, or other countries, we can continue trading with you. US, fuck off. The West, fuck off. You know, that's kind of how I see it, but it might be more complicated than that. So if you have any more information to add to this issue, let us know in the chat or in the comments below. And thanks for watching.
Thank you!
Thank you.